In the dust-choked town of Elmsworth, where the sun hung low like a weary traveler, the weary silence of the day was punctuated only by the occasional distant clop of hooves on parched earth. The sky, a bruised canvas of orange and purple, mirrored the broken lives that inhabited this place. The saloon doors creaked ominously on their hinges, an invitation to drown one's sorrows, yet for most it remained a desolate refuge. Here, under the tyranny of routine, men wore their hardships like badges, their unspoken stories embedded in the lines of their weathered faces. Charlie McGraw stood on the porch of his dusty ranch house, the weight of grief draping over his shoulders like a heavy cloak. His once vibrant home, now a faded testament to lost dreams, echoed with the absence of laughter. A year had passed since tragedy struck, leaving Charlie with a hollow heart and a solitary existence. Life had become a monotonous rhythm of chores and silence, punctuated only by the visits of his maid, Clara. The two shared an unacknowledged bond forged through the weight of unspoken sorrow, each trapped in their own storm, their lives intertwined like the tangled roots of desert grass. Clara moved with a quiet grace, her presence both a balm and a reminder. She swept through the rooms with precision, her hands working tirelessly, yet her spirit seemed heavy, as if shadows trailed her every step. Charlie often caught her glancing out the window, her gaze lost in the horizon, a place that seemed perpetually out of reach. Today, however, something was different. As she adjusted the curtains, the fading light revealed the bruises that marred her arms, dark, angry splotches against her pale skin. Charlie's heart lurched. He recognized them, the telltale signs of suffering, and felt the familiar tightening in his chest that had become all too common in recent months. In a world where silence spoke louder than words, Charlie wrestled with the urge to intervene. He had seen enough in his lifetime to recognize the pain reflected in Clara's sorrowful eyes, but confronting it felt dangerous, a fire he was hesitant to stoke. Instead, he turned his gaze to the ground, focusing on the dust swirling beneath his boots, allowing the chaos of his thoughts to consume him. With each passing moment, a storm brewed within him, torn between the desire to shield her from her torment and the paralyzing fear of repercussions. Clara caught his eye, her own expression a mixture of defiance and resignation, as if she noticed his internal struggle, and yet she said nothing. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, brimming with the weight of unasked questions. At that moment, Charlie felt the stirrings of a distant resolve, a flicker ignited by the sight of her suffering. He clenched his fists at his sides, the adrenaline surging through him like a sudden squall in the desert. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, closing the chasm that had threatened to swallow them both. He lifted his hand, brushing aside the creeping fog of indecision. There, on that porch, beneath the fading light, Charlie made a choice that would ripple through Elmsworth like the first crack of thunder on a dry summer day. He wouldn't remain a bystander to Clara's pain any longer. He would stand with her, even if it meant challenging the very foundations of their fragile world. As he moved closer, a sense of purpose ignited within him, illuminating the remnants of his shattered spirit. The town had long since turned a blind eye, but in that moment, Charlie resolved to break the silence that had smothered the truth. With Clara at his side, he would face the darkness that had gripped their lives and redefine what it meant to be brave in a world that so easily succumbed to despair. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting Elmsworth in deepening shadows, a sudden breeze swept through the porch, carrying with it an ominous chill. The night had a way of sneaking up on the weary, just as despair had a habit of settling unnoticed into the hearts of men. Charlie stood there, the air thick with expectancy, when he first heard the distant sound of hoofbeats, steady and deliberate, echoing through the dusty streets like a harbinger of change. His heart raced at the prospect of a visitor, a welcome distraction from the solitude that had so consumed him. From the dim light of the saloon, a figure emerged, silhouetted against the fading twilight. A man, tall and rugged, with a long duster that flared like a storm cloud around him. His hat cast a shadow over his face, protecting his features from the probing eyes of the townsfolk. But Charlie felt an unsettling energy radiate from him, as if he were a force of nature, a sudden squall, breaking the monotony of the dry expanse. The steady clop of hooves turned to a halt just outside the ranch, and the mysterious rider dismounted with an ease that bespoke familiarity and purpose. Approaching the porch, the man stopped short, his eyes quickly scanning the scene, settling on Charlie, and then drifting towards Clara, still standing beneath the weight of a world that seemed ever more burdensome. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken words, and the mysterious stranger's presence cast a long shadow over them both. There was something hauntingly familiar in his demeanor, a silent understanding born from shared pain and loss, and Charlie's instinct urged him to step in front of Clara, a futile instinct to shield her from scrutiny. Clara, caught in the act of observing the newcomer, felt the air shift around her as realization dawned. Though she had never seen the man before, his presence startled her, igniting a flicker of both recognition and fear in the pit of her stomach. She instinctively pulled her sleeves down, as if to hide the bruises that told her story. The stranger's gaze softened momentarily as it met her eyes, and in that fleeting connection, Charlie saw an exchange that hinted at something deeper than mere chance, a shared acknowledgement of suffering, as if she had been seen for the first time. The silence persisted between them, drawn tight, electric with the unuttered truths that lurked in the corners of the dusk. Finally, the man broke that silence with a voice that carried the weight of distant mountains. "You're not alone, you know." His words were not directed at Charlie, but rather a lifeline thrown toward Clara. She flinched, caught off guard by the unexpected empathy, and Charlie clenched his jaw, his instincts flaring in defense of her vulnerability. The man took a single step forward, his posture respectful yet firm, a quiet challenge against the injustices that often thrived undisturbed within the town. In that moment, Charlie's heart surged with an unanticipated sense of kinship. The rider had recognized the bruises not merely as marks on flesh, but as the evidence of a silent battle that raged behind closed doors. Charlie felt a potent mix of gratitude and defiance swell within him, an acknowledgement that he was not the only one who saw Clara's suffering. The air crackled with uncertainty, but beneath it lay a burgeoning solidarity that threatened to disrupt the oppressive silence binding them all. Charlie inhaled deeply, as if drawing strength from the unfolding night. He turned slowly to Clara, who stood there, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The mysterious figure had cast a light upon their hidden sorrows, igniting a flame within him that could no longer be extinguished. Together, they would confront the shadows that loomed within Elmsworth, and for the first time in a long while, Charlie felt the stirrings of resolve wash over him. It was time to break the silence, to challenge the unseen oppressor lurking in the recesses of their lives, and to stand together against the darkness that had held them captive for far too long. The night settled over Elmsworth like a thick blanket, the twilight deepening until the stars blinked hesitantly into view. The saloon doors creaked intermittently behind the stranger, casting flickering shadows on the porch. Charlie's heart beat loudly in his chest, a metronome to the moment, as he remained locked in a silent standoff with the newcomer. Clara, standing beside him, seemed to draw into herself, the bruises on her arms now a constellation of unspoken truths under the scrutiny of the stranger's gaze. In that charged silence, time felt frozen, and the world around them faded into insignificance. Charlie's mind raced, the weight of Clara's suffering pressing heavily upon him, juxtaposed against the quiet courage emanating from the stranger. An understanding coursed through the air, palpable and raw, daring Charlie to step beyond the confines of his own fear. Every instinct told him to protect Clara, to shield her from the harsh realities that were inseparable from her existence. Yet here was a man offering a glimpse of empathy, a lifeline stretching across the chasm of their despair. With a slow, deliberate breath, Charlie found his voice. "I know," he started, his words tentative but resolute. The intensity of his own emotions pooled in the depths of his chest as he turned to Clara, feeling her presence like a breath of fresh air. "You are not alone." The declaration reverberated as a pledge, resonating with the silent understanding that had anchored him in this moment. Clara's eyes darted to his, disbelief mingling with gratitude, as though she had been suddenly freed from the shackles of solitude that had long been her only companion. The stranger nodded, allowing the weight of Charlie's words to settle into the air between them. With a subtle shift, he stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "We can't change the past," he said, his focus shifting back to Clara, "but we can fight for a future." The sincerity in his tone bore no hint of judgment, only a compassion that held space for shared pain. Clara's shoulders relaxed just a hair, the tension that made her shadow seem heavier easing as hope began to unfurl within her. With a rush of unexpected courage, Clara took a step forward, the bruises on her arms exposed in the fleeting light. "It's not just me," she whispered, each word a fragile surrender, revealing the depth of her struggle. The raw honesty hung in the air like a delicate thread, severing the silence that had surrounded them for far too long. Charlie's heart thundered. A storm of emotions swelled inside him, propelling him into action. He drew closer to her, urgency coursing through him as he stood shoulder to shoulder with her, an unwavering support in the face of adversity. The moment transformed the porch into a sanctuary, a space where vulnerability met unwavering resolve. As Clara spoke, Charlie's hand gently rested on the small of her back, a gesture that anchored her while igniting a fire of solidarity between them. The stranger bore witness to this awakening, his presence an unexpected catalyst that poured gasoline on the flickering flame of courage within Charlie. The first stirrings of rebellion against the silence that had long enveloped their lives began to take shape, and in that small, intimate exchange, an unspoken promise was forged. They would confront the demons that had cast long shadows over Elmsworth, together. The tension in the air thickened, each heartbeat a drumroll of anticipation as Clara stood exposed before the stranger and Charlie. Shadows flickered across her face, betraying a swell of emotions that had long been banished to the recesses of her heart. She felt the weight of both men's gazes, one protective, the other an unsettling blend of understanding and resolve. The silence held its breath, and Clara found herself teetering on the edge of a precipice. One step closer to truth could unravel a lifetime of silence. Charlie, acutely aware of the palpable charge between them, tightened his grip on Clara's shoulder, a silent vow that he would not let her face this alone. His mind raced with questions about the stranger's sudden intrusion, yet all thoughts spiraled back to her, how she carried the weight of her bruises like a shroud, as if accepting that suffering was her only companion. He had seen men like her tormentors before, rough and unyielding as the desert itself, and the thought of them surfacing brought a simmering anger to the fore. But beneath that anger lay a deeper uncertainty, a fear of venturing into territory that could unleash consequences he felt unprepared to face. The stranger's presence was magnetic, yet disquieting. He stood tall, shoulders squared, radiating a quiet strength that contrasted sharply with the frailty Clara exhibited. With deliberate calm, the man took a half-step closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "You don't have to bear this burden in silence," he said softly, words meant to reassure but carrying the weight of something more, an invitation to step into the light. Clara's breath hitched at the sound of his voice, the vulnerability of his gaze cutting through the curtain of her forced composure. Charlie felt a tightness in his chest, an instinctual urge to shield Clara from the stranger's probing insight. He stepped forward, as if to form a barrier, but faltered at the flicker of hope igniting in Clara's eyes. There was a trembling strength in her that he had never noticed before, a flicker of defiance hidden beneath her pain. He realized that perhaps this stranger was not merely an intruder, but a messenger, one who had arrived at the dawn of their shared awakening. Charlie's heart ached, torn between the urge to protect and the necessity to allow Clara the freedom to embrace her own truth, however painful. As Clara's eyes remained locked on the strangers, Charlie felt an unfamiliar swell of emotions, a mix of pride and trepidation. In that moment, he was stripped bare of his defenses, forced to confront the shame of his own inaction. He had long accepted his grief as a solitary burden, but now he questioned whether he had been equally complicit in Clara's silence. Could he have been the anchor she needed, allowing her to voice her struggles rather than suffer in the shadows? The weight of that realization settled heavy upon him, even as Clara teetered on the brink of a declaration that could prompt a reckoning in Elmsworth. But it was Clara's voice that broke through the tension, raw and unsteady. "I want to be free of this pain," she said, her words like an ember catching fire in a dry field. The admission hung in the air, a challenge to everything they had known. Charlie watched as the stranger nodded, a glimmer of respect flashing in his eyes, affirming the tentative strength she was beginning to claim. In contrast, Charlie's heart raced with a turbulent blend of hope and fear, unsure if he could become the ally she needed, the one who would stand beside her as she faced the impending storm. Underneath the darkening sky, time felt suspended, as if the very world around them held its breath for what was to come. Clara took a deep breath, her shoulders squared, and for the first time, Charlie recognized her as a woman ready to reclaim her narrative. It was a moment of dawning courage, a fortitude drawn not just from her own suffering, but from the quiet solidarity shared with him and the stranger. The three of them stood at the precipice, poised on the cusp of change, under the weight of unspoken truths that could either bind them together or tear them apart. This was where their stories intersected, and Charlie silently vowed to follow her lead, wherever that path might take them. As the stars flickered into existence above Elmsworth, the atmosphere pulsed with a newfound energy, a rare resonance that twisted through the tangled silence of the night. Charlie stood alongside Clara, the weight of her pain pulsing like a distant thunder, reverberating through the depths of his own grief. His heart pounded a frenetic rhythm, each beat a reminder of the urgency brewing between them. Clara's breath hitched, caught in the delicate web of unexpressed truths, and Charlie felt the intensity of the moment surge like a storm cloud ready to burst. Clara's lips parted slightly, a tremor coursing through her as she fought against the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Charlie could see the internal struggle flickering in her eyes, the battle between the instinct to retreat and the desire to break free. He stepped closer, reducing the distance between them, providing her with a quiet strength that emanated from his resolve. The air around them felt charged, and in those moments of silence, he contemplated the depth of her suffering, bruises that told a story far greater than either of them had been willing to voice. The stranger watched, his presence an anchor for both of them, yet it was ultimately Clara who took the next step. She shifted her weight, her hands trembling slightly as she clenched them at her sides, the small motions betraying the flood of vulnerability crashing against her self-restraint. In that instant, as she opened her mouth to speak, Charlie's heart raced with anticipation, desperately willing her to unearth the truth that had been buried beneath layers of fear and silence. "I've carried this pain for too long," Clara finally whispered, her voice fragile yet resolute, an echo of the strength that had long lain dormant within her. Charlie felt a rush of gratitude mingle with pride as he listened to her vulnerability unfurl. Her words hung in the night like tender lanterns, illuminating the darkness that had shrouded her existence. It was as if the wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of something new, hope, perhaps. Charlie's gaze flitted to the bruises that marked Clara's arms, a landscape of suffering that threatened to crack the facade of normalcy that Elmsworth had imposed upon them. He felt an overwhelming urge to bridge the gap of pain that stretched between them, to become the protector she so desperately needed. Without thinking, he reached out, gently wrapping his fingers around her wrist. His touch was tender, hardly more than a whisper of connection, yet it sparked a profound sense of understanding. Clara looked up, their eyes locking in a moment that transcended words, and Charlie saw in her a reflection of his own grief. An acknowledgement that they were both survivors of their circumstances. The silence that enveloped them morphed, transforming the tension into a sanctuary of shared resilience. The stranger, sensing the shifting tides of emotion, took a half step back, allowing the moment to crystallize between Charlie and Clara. It was a silent agreement. He understood that this was a bond that needed no further interference. Clara's lips quivered as she fought against the tide of emotion welling up inside her, the weight of having been seen resting heavily on her chest. In that silent exchange, Charlie resolved to be more than an observer in her life. He would stand beside her, steadfast against the currents of pain that had sought to drown them both. As the moon cast a silvery glow across the porch, illuminating their shared vulnerability, Charlie felt a burgeoning flame ignite within him, a desire to protect, to defy. He squeezed Clara's wrist gently, grounding her as he stepped fully into the space they shared. "We'll face this together," he said, his voice a low rumble, a pledge against the darkness that had long held them both captive. And as Clara met his gaze, strands of hope began to weave their way into the fabric of their lives, promising a rebellion against the silence that had muted their spirits for far too long. As the moon cloaked the porch in its silvery glow, the air held a tremor, a charged silence thick with unspoken truths. Clara's hand lingered beneath Charlie's grip, the warmth radiating from his touch a stark contrast to the chill that had settled over her heart. She looked up, and in her eyes, Charlie saw a reflection of his own damning resolve, a mutual yearning to confront the darkness that had woven its way into their lives. In that moment, the world around them faded away, leaving only the fragile bond they were forging, a flicker of defiance against the oppressive silence. With a shared understanding, Clara took a deep breath, her shoulders pulling back slightly as if shedding the weight of her concealments. And there, in the stillness of the night, she took a step forward, drawing courage from the flicker of strength that had ignited between them. She spoke again, her voice gaining volume and clarity. "I won't hide anymore," she declared, each word imbued with newfound determination. As if invigorated by her own proclamation, Charlie felt a swell of pride course through him. The resolve that had been dormant within him began to awaken alongside her, an unyielding force demanding to be seen. At that moment, the stranger, a silent sentinel to their awakening, read the tumult within Clara's heart. He took a step closer again, his expression morphing from passive observer to active protector. "You deserve a voice," he affirmed, his tone steady, yet imbued with an air of compassion that wrapped around Clara like a protective shroud. It was a gesture steeped in understanding, a declaration that echoed the unspoken promise Charlie had made to stand with her. The stranger's presence solidified the burgeoning alliance, a shared defiance against the injustices they had faced alone for far too long. Charlie met the stranger's gaze, recognizing the significance of the moment, each of them converging in their silent fight against the forces that sought to suppress them. Clara, emboldened by their solidarity, looked between the two men, their shared acknowledgement sparking a fire within her that threatened to illuminate the darkest corners of her past. In that flicker of empowerment, something shifted in her. The weight of her bruises felt lighter, and the burden of shame began to lift, allowing her to rise unshackled by her fears. Standing tall, Clara released a deliberate breath, each exhale a quiet declaration of her readiness to challenge the shadows. Charlie stepped to her side, their shoulders brushing, a protective barrier against the ghosts that had long haunted her. And as the stranger continued to hold his ground, a sentinel against the encroaching silence, they formed a triad of resilience, a fortress against the pain woven into the very fabric of their lives. The three of them, united in their resolve, shared a collective breath, a silent vow that the time for endurance had given way to action. The echoes of their unspoken alliance rippled through the deserted streets of Elmsworth, each heart pounding a resonant rhythm against the backdrop of the darkened town. The wind whispered promises of change, carrying the weight of their shared resolve into the night. Clara, emboldened by the unwavering support of both men, felt the stirrings of bravery ignite within her. Together, they would rise against the shadows, break the chains of silence, and challenge the very foundations of their world. A testament to the power of shared vulnerability and the unyielding spirit that could transform grief into resilience. In the gathering darkness, Charlie felt the echoes of the distant clop of hooves reverberate in the silence of Elmsworth, a rhythm that mirrored the pounding of his heart. Clara stood beside him, her fragile courage illuminating the corners of his soul that had lingered in shadow for too long. The air thickened around them, pregnant with the weight of unspoken histories, the unrelenting remnants of past traumas that threatened to suffocate any flicker of hope. The bruises on Clara's arms were not just marks of a painful present. They bore witness to a history that resonated with his own unhealed wounds, a tapestry of suffering woven into the fabric of their lives. As the wind whipped through the porch, carrying the scent of impending rain, Charlie recalled the echoes of his own youth, the nights spent in fearful silence when shouting voices echoed through the dimly lit halls of his childhood home. He had watched from the shadows as his mother had borne the brunt of his father's temper, the same familiar darkness chasing her down like a predator, leaving her marked not just in body, but in spirit. Those memories flooded him, their jagged edges cutting deeper than any physical blow. He saw Clara stand as if shackled by the weight of her suffering, and he could not bear the thought of history repeating itself in her life. With each passing moment, he grappled with the urgency to protect her, feeling the invisible chains of his own childhood tighten around him. Instinctively, Charlie stepped closer to Clara, shielding her from the harshness of the world that had conspired to silence them both. The weight of his past surged within him like a tidal wave, reminding him of the promise he had made to himself long ago, that he would never allow anyone else to suffer as he had. He recalled the day he'd finally found his voice, the searing moment when he stood up to his father, shouting into the tempest of abuse that had long suffocated their home. It had taken everything in him, a heart swollen with fear, to confront that specter of violence, but in doing so he had found the strength to reclaim his own existence. Now standing on that porch with Clara by his side, Charlie felt an urgency unfurl within him, a desperate need to ensure that she did not succumb to the same suffocating silence that had haunted his past. He turned to her, his voice barely a whisper, yet anchored in resolve. "You deserve to be free, Clara," he said, the words falling from his lips like a benediction. The sincerity of his tone wrapped around her like a warm embrace, allowing her to draw strength from the connection they shared. There was no need for grand proclamations. It was the silent understanding between them that painted a vivid picture of solidarity, for he knew that they needed each other now more than ever. The stranger, an observer turned ally, stepped forward, his presence somehow anchoring the storm that had been swirling within Clara. He shifted slightly, allowing the weight of his gaze to rest upon her, his expression neither judgmental nor intrusive. Charlie felt a flicker of gratitude for him, recognizing that it was his arrival that had prompted this awakening in Clara, an unexpected catalyst for the change they so desperately sought. The moment crystallized amidst the backdrop of the deepening night, a turning point where vulnerability met strength, where two injured souls stood together against the tempest that had long sought to erode their spirits. With newfound resolve, Clara took a deep breath, her eyes glistening beneath the moonlight as she drew strength from the unexpected allies before her. Two men whose lives had been entwined by fate, uniting in a bond forged through shared pain. She felt the weight of isolation that had burdened her for so long begin to lift, replaced by a flickering hope that dared to illuminate the darkness. Charlie released a steadying exhale, knowing that together they would rise against the tide of their adversities, reclaiming their narratives from the silence that had sought to shackle them. He was ready to face the shadows of the past, not just for himself, but for Clara, transforming the weight of grief into a shared journey toward healing. The night deepened, a thick blanket of silence wrapping around the town of Elmsworth, but the air between Charlie, Clara, and the stranger crackled with unresolved tension. Clara stood between the two men, the weight of their collective gaze pressing down on her. The moment they had all shared, the promise of solidarity, felt precarious, fragile as a spider's web glistening under the moonlight. Charlie's heart raced as the realization dawned that they were teetering on the edge of something profound, yet deep within him lay a seed of doubt, threatening to unravel the tenuous bond they had forged. "Are you certain about this?" Clara's voice trembled as she glanced between them, her vulnerability surfacing with startling clarity. The confidence that had buoyed her moments ago flickered like a candle in a gusting wind. Charlie felt a pang in his heart. Her uncertainty was a mirror, reflecting his own fears. He had thought he was brave, that he could be the shield she needed, but what if she faltered in her newfound resolve? What if the weight of her history became too much to bear, and once again she would retreat into silence? The stranger took a half step back, sensing the shift in atmosphere, his brow furrowed with concern. The silent exchange between Clara and Charlie felt charged, heavy with the echoes of their unresolved traumas. "You don't have to do this alone, Clara," he said gently, breaking the tension that had settled between them like a shroud. "You can speak your truth. We're here." Yet his words felt oddly distant to Charlie, who feared the stranger was not aware of the complexities that lay beneath Clara's bravado. What if she wasn't ready to expose the raw wounds that lay beneath her skin? As Clara met Charlie's eyes, her gaze flickered with uncertainty. "What if I can't?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Those 4 simple words struck him like a thunderclap, reverberating through the stillness. It felt as if the ground beneath them had shifted. The bond they had just begun to forge now hung in delicate balance, the air thick with the weight of her self-doubt. Charlie's instinct kicked in, the urge to reassure her, to tell her that they would face whatever came together, but the fear of saying the wrong thing gripped him tight. Charlie felt disoriented, torn between the desire to pull Clara closer and the urge to stand back and give her space to express herself. He clenched his fists at his sides, wrestling with his own tumultuous emotions, caught in a web of uncertainty. "You won't know until you try," he murmured, the words feeling inadequate like whispers against the howling wind. But Clara's face paled, and Charlie felt a sense of urgency rise within him. The knowledge that he could be part of her liberation, yet unsure how, made his chest constrict painfully. What if she couldn't bear the weight of their alliance? What if he inadvertently pushed her back into her shell of silence? The tension swelled until it became almost unbearable, the air thick with unspoken fears that loomed over them. Clara looked away, her gaze drifting back to the horizon, the place that had always seemed just out of reach. The shadow of doubt cast over their moment began to loom larger, twisting into a misunderstanding that threatened to sever the fragile thread that tied them together. Charlie's heart sank as he watched her retreat behind the veil of her uncertainty. The flicker of courage that had ignited earlier now dimmed against the dark canvas of her doubt. It was a moment of silent conflict, one that tested the very foundation of their connection, leaving Charlie grappling for a way to guide her back into the light. The wind took on a sharper edge as the night deepened, and the air crackled with a tension that heralded the approach of something ominous. From the shadows of the saloon, laughter echoed, mingling with the raucous sounds of men consuming their sorrows. unaware of the quiet storm brewing just outside. The commotion carried with it the scent of whiskey and sweat, a stark contrast to the fragile moment shared between Charlie, Clara, and the stranger. For all the resilience they had summoned, the reality of Elmsworth lay heavily on their shoulders. A world that had long condoned suffering behind closed doors, a landscape littered with unchallenged injustices. As Clara's gaze drifted toward the horizon, she felt a sense of impending dread wash over her, the shadows in her heart echoing the insecurities that faced her. The distant laughter grew louder, a reminder of the wild, reckless nature that sometimes swept through men like a savage wind, and she instinctively pulled back, her shoulders curving inward as if to shield herself from an unseen threat. Charlie saw the shift in her posture and felt a pang of frustration mix with urgency. He needed to support her, to remind her of the strength they shared. Each heartbeat between them heightened the awareness of vulnerability. But it was a fleeting moment, disrupted by the unmistakable sound of boots stomping on the wooden planks of the porch. A gang of men, rowdy and emboldened by drink, stumbled out of the saloon, their raucous laughter ringing like a death knell in the still air. They swaggered into view, their eyes scanning the night, mouths stretched into crude grins that revealed too many bad intentions. Charlie's chest tightened, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling in warning. He instinctively stepped in front of Clara, a protective barrier against the chaos that threatened to spiral out of control. The stranger shifted slightly, bracing himself for whatever storm was brewing, and in that moment, a shared understanding passed between them, a call to arms against the encroaching darkness. The leader of the pack, a hulking man with a scar running down his cheek, caught sight of Clara and let out a low whistle, his gaze lingering on her with an unsettling mix of hunger and malice. "Well, well, look what we found here. A pretty little flower hiding in the weeds," he sneered, punctuating his words with a swagger that reeked of entitlement. Clara flinched at the sound of his voice, her earlier courage wavering as the heaviness of his gaze bore down on her like a crushing weight. Charlie felt his blood boil, the pent-up anger he had tried to suppress surging to the surface, fueled by the agony of his own past and the raw, palpable fear etched on Clara's face. "Leave her alone," Charlie's voice rang out, steadier than he felt, echoing against the wooden structure of the porch. It felt both foreign and familiar as he stepped forward, drawing a line in the dust between them and the looming threat. The laughter faded, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to engulf them, and the leader's eyes narrowed, a fresh glint of menace igniting within their depths. The moment felt suspended, the tension thickening like the approaching storm clouds that gathered silently overhead, threatening to unleash their fury at any moment. "What's it to you, cowboy?" the man taunted, taking a swaggering step closer, his entourage fanning out like a pack of wolves, drawn to the scent of vulnerability. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, and she held her breath as Charlie stood his ground, every instinct in him screaming to protect her from the chaos that threatened to engulf them. He felt the weight of the stranger's presence behind him, a quiet support that bolstered his resolve. In that charged silence, the stakes surged, and Charlie understood the gravity of what lay ahead. There was no choice now. He had to confront the past that had haunted him, and the future that Clara longed for. With a low growl, Charlie straightened, his jaw clenched, and his eyes steely with determination. "It's everything to me," he stated, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The air crackled with unspoken words, the atmosphere charged with a mix of fear and defiance. The leader paused, caught off guard by the unexpected stand, but his surprise was short-lived as he quickly recovered, a mocking smile creeping back onto his lips. The tension between them coiled tightly, the moment poised to snap, and Charlie braced himself for what was to come, knowing all too well that the storm was now upon them. The air shimmered with a tension that felt electric, the weight of uncertainty hanging heavily over the porch of Charlie McGraw's ranch house. The men emerging from the saloon were a storm in human form, their brash laughter cutting through the night like a jagged chorus promising chaos. In that moment, as Charlie stood resolutely in front of Clara, the world around them faded into a deep silence, a bubble of loyalty encasing them within the looming threat. Clara's heart raced, and while fear threatened to pull her under, the firmness of Charlie's presence anchored her to the ground. Charlie's gaze remained locked on the leader, the man's mocking demeanor failing to intimidate him as he clenched his fists at his sides. The scarred brute smirked, revealing a row of crooked teeth that seemed to gleam with malice under the sparse light. Yet, behind Charlie's steely exterior, a tempest raged, a struggle between anxiety and the burgeoning resolve that had taken root since Clara had begun to unravel the chains binding her. For the first time, he saw her not just as a survivor of silent struggles, but as a woman deserving of protection strong enough to stand against the darkness that had sought to engulf them both. "Leave her be." Charlie's voice was low but steady, a rumble of thunder against the oppressive silence. Clara, standing beside him, could feel the heat radiating from his body, the tension coiling between them like a taut wire ready to snap. She glanced up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and awe, the bond of shared experiences weaving tighter in the face of impending confrontation. In this moment, Charlie was more than just a man with a haunted past. He was her shield against the storms that had long raged in silence, a loyal companion ready to challenge the shadows that had threatened to consume her. The leader took a step closer, his entourage shifting behind him, like wolves scenting blood in the air. Charlie felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end, his instincts screaming at him to protect Clara at all costs. He could see the fear flickering in her eyes, a reminder of the silent battles she had faced alone. Yet, at that moment, something within her blossomed, a silent understanding that she was not alone anymore, that together they could unravel the darkness that had long kept them captive. Her heartbeat echoed in the stillness, a surge of loyalty that resonated deep in Charlie's chest, knitting their fates together against the rising tide. The tension escalated as the leader raised an eyebrow, amused at the audacity of Charlie's defiance. "You think standing there will change anything?" He snorted, mock disbelief etched across his features. But Charlie stood firm, the resolve in his posture speaking louder than any retort he could muster. He glanced at Clara, seeing her courage bolster with each passing second. They were two souls united in their fight, and in that shared silence, they communicated a vow that surpassed mere words. They would face this darkness together, shoulder to shoulder, as allies against the cruelty of a world that sought to keep them silent. With a low growl, the leader edged closer, and Charlie felt that familiar burn of anger rising within him. Yet he remained grounded, drawing strength from Clara's unwavering presence. The world around them faded, the mocking laughter of the men behind the leader slipping into the background, as if the universe itself had conspired to grant them this singular moment. In that fragile bubble of loyalty, with Clara at his side, he stood willing to risk it all, to confront the demons that had haunted them both and declare their readiness to reclaim their lives. The shadows, however looming, would not define them, not tonight. Together, they would rise. The tension split the air like a lightning bolt, surging between the men and amplifying the burgeoning storm of emotions that brewed on the porch. Charlie stood resolute, his heart pounding like a war drum as Clara remained by his side, a fragile flower in the shadow of looming darkness. Memories of his mother flooded his mind, the way she had once stood toe to toe with his father, trembling yet unyielding. It was a memory laced with anguish, but also one that bore the seeds of strength. He had always admired her courage, the resilience she had summoned, even when the world bore down upon her, stifling her spirit. But the ache of helplessness gnawed at him, for he had been a child then, powerless to intervene. Now, as an adult, he found himself teetering on the precipice of that same helplessness, Charlie had spent years wrestling with the ghosts of his past, hoping to block out the memories of violence that had shaped his childhood. His father's rage had carved deep trenches into his psyche, but in Clara's bruises he recognized that same cycle of suffering, a harrowing reminder that silent battles often raged behind closed doors. As he braced against the threat posed by the man before him, Charlie clenched his fists, the coarse wood of the porch beneath his feet, grounding him to the moment. He could not, would not, allow history to repeat itself, not with Clara standing at his side. The solidarity they shared in that moment pulsed within him, a flame of defiance igniting against the gathering storm. Yet it was Clara's quiet strength that truly took hold of him, her presence a balm for his fractured spirit. Though she trembled, the flicker of resolve within her sparked a determination in him to confront the shadows that had haunted both their lives. In their silence, he sensed the unspoken bond that had blossomed throughout their shared anguish, a fragile yet potent connection that transcended words. It was her vulnerability laid bare, the bruises marking her arms that steeled his spine. She was vulnerable but not weak, deserving of a voice, and he could not let her stand alone against this mighty tide. As the leader advanced, cocky and brimming with malevolence, the world around them twisted into focus. The air thickened, charged with the weight of unspoken histories, as the men surrounding their adversary exchanged glances, ripe with anticipation. Charlie's eyes flicked toward the growing shadows, deepening beneath the porch as he locked his gaze onto Clara. The silence that enveloped them resonated with the echoes of their shared past, an acknowledgement that neither of them had ever leaned into the vulnerability of their truth. But now they had come to a turning point. It was time to reclaim the narratives that had long kept them entrapped. With a surge of adrenaline coursing through him, Charlie took a step forward, the earth beneath him stabilizing with a newfound determination. "You don't scare me," he said, his voice steady, cutting through the hollow laughter that reverberated from the men. In that moment, he chose to confront the reality of their situation, a visceral roar against the betrayals of their pasts. The leader's eyes narrowed, the mirth evaporating as his bravado faltered. Charlie felt the tide shift, sensing that Clara could feel it too, the electricity that pulsed in the air between them, eager to elevate them beyond the shadows that had kept them silent for too long. The gang stumbled back slightly, their confidence shaken by the unexpected stalwartness of Charlie's stance, and in that split second, Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was a flicker of hope igniting within her, a belief that perhaps they could break free from the confines of their pasts. As Charlie stood firm, determined to shield her from the storm before them, they reached an unspoken agreement. This was no longer about just surviving. It was about reclaiming the narratives they had both been robbed of, about rising together from the ashes of their collective pain. And as the winds howled around them, a heavy weight lifted from Clara's heart. She felt her own voice rise within, tenacious and fierce, ready to stand alongside him. In this moment of unyielding solidarity, they were no longer just victims of the past. They were determined fighters, no longer willing to succumb to the shadows that had plagued Elmsworth for far too long. With Charlie standing steadfastly at her side, Clara felt hope bloom amid the chaos, a fragile yet unbreakable bond cemented in that singular moment, whispering promises of resilience and strength in a world that had often turned a blind eye. The moment felt weighted, hovering in the stillness of the night as Clara stood beside Charlie, her heart drumming against the wall of her chest like a desperate plea for freedom. The leader's bravado faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his brow as he sized up the defiance radiating from Charlie. The men surrounding him exchanged glances, their amusement fading, replaced by a simmering tension that thickened the air. Clara felt the world narrow to the three of them, the threats lurking outside the porch slipping into the background. Within this charged atmosphere, she understood, perhaps for the first time, that she was not alone in her battle. Charlie's fists clenched tight as he prepared to respond to the leader's inevitable taunts. There was a resolve that coursed through him now, ignited not just by anger, but by an unwavering commitment to protect Clara. The man before him, despite his disheveled appearance, was an embodiment of the very darkness they had both endured in silence. The shadows of their pasts threatened to swallow them whole. But Charlie stood firm, anchored by the fragile yet fierce bond they had forged through their shared suffering. In that moment, he was not just a lonely cowboy. He was Clara's shield, standing defiantly against the tide of cruelty. With a scoff, the leader stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over the porch. "You think you can protect her?" he sneered, his voice dripping with scorn. "She's still nothing but a fragile little thing hiding behind a man's bravado." The words hung thick in the air, a stark reminder of the very essence of abuse that Clara had endured all her life. But as Charlie glanced at her, he saw the fire igniting within her, an ember of resilience that finally dared to break free from the chains of silence. It emboldened him as he held her gaze, both of them clinging to the promise that they would confront their demons together, no matter the cost. Then, without warning, Clara moved closer to the edge of the porch, fear melting away as she found her voice amid the suffocating tension. "I'm not fragile," she said, each syllable firm and unwavering. The declaration hung in the air, an audacious challenge that cut through the darkness like a blade. Charlie's breath caught, pride surging within him as he watched her reclaim her narrative, the bruises on her arms seeming to vanish beneath the strength of her resolve. He felt the shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer just about him defending her, but about them standing united, a testament to their strength against the gathering storm. Anger sparked in the leader's eyes, and he took a threatening step forward, the men behind him bristling with tension. "You're treading on dangerous ground, little flower," he spat, venom lacing his words. But Clara remained steadfast, her chin lifted defiantly, and Charlie stepped forward, closing the gap between them. The instinct to protect flared within him, but it was now mixed with the recognition of Clara's fierce spirit. They were intertwined in this moment, two souls emboldened by their shared pain, ready to redefine their story in a world that had tried to silence them both. The weight of their unspoken bond rippled through the air as the winds howled around them. "What do you want?" Charlie demanded, his voice steady despite the pounding rhythm of his heart. He faced the leader without flinching, feeling the collective tension manifest as palpable energy that surged between the three of them. "You think you can intimidate her by hiding behind your gang? You're wrong," he added, his gaze fierce. The challenge hung unspoken, daring the man to tip the balance further, but Clara could feel the gathering storm of fear weaving through Charlie, and she reached her hand to his, intertwining their fingers. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke louder than any words. She would not let him face this alone. As the dark clouds loomed overhead, it became clear that the fragile bond they had nurtured faced a final test. The leader's expression morphed from amusement to rage, and Clara held her breath, urgency surging beneath her skin. Charlie remained resolute. This was not merely about defending her, it was about confronting the demons they had both carried, about standing against the very darkness that had sought to unravel their lives. Clara squeezed his hand tightly, an unspoken communication passing between them, affirming their unwavering connection. In the face of impending chaos, they stood together, two souls ready to rewrite their fates, not just for themselves, but for all those who had suffered in silence like they had. And with the wind picking up around them, it felt as though the very universe was holding its breath, anticipating the upheaval that was about to unfold in Elmsworth. The tension on the porch reached a breaking point, as if the very air crackled with the impending storm that loomed above Elmsworth. Clara stood resolute, her fingers entwined with Charlie's, grounding herself in the strength of his unwavering presence. The men surrounding the leader exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado wavering in the face of Clara's fierce defiance. The leader, caught off guard by her audacity, hesitated, and for a fleeting moment, the world around them felt suspended, as if time held its breath, waiting for the tumultuous tide to shift. "Don't you dare underestimate her," Charlie said, his voice low but thunderous in its conviction. With each word, he held the line, feeling the electric current of his resolve bolster Clara's. The leader's sneer faltered, uncertainty creeping into his eyes as he faced the unwavering bond before him. Two souls entwined in a united front, refusing to be silenced any longer. The shadows that had loomed over Clara for far too long began to recede, driven back by the fierce light of her defiance intermingled with Charlie's protective bravado. With a sudden growl, the leader lunged forward, his instincts fueled by the need to assert dominance. But Charlie stood firm, positioning himself as a barrier between Clara and the storm of violence threatening to erupt. Clara pressed against the warmth of Charlie's back, the intimacy of their connection fortifying her spirit. The world melted away, and in this space she felt the pulse of her own courage, rooted in the knowledge that she was no longer alone. This time, she would fight back, reclaiming the narrative of her existence with every breath she took. As moments stretched into an eternity, the men behind the leader shuffled uneasily, their conviction faltering in the face of their leader's aggression. Charlie's steady gaze remained locked on the leader, unyielding and fierce. The tide had shifted, and Clara's heart raced in harmony with the rhythm of their shared defiance. Every beat echoed through her bones, igniting a fire that had long been dimmed. In the midst of chaos, she felt a sense of liberation, as if the chains that had bound her spirit for so long were finally beginning to rust away. Then, as if in answer to their quiet rebellion, the storm clouds parted, revealing glimmers of moonlight weaving through the tumult. The leader hesitated, sensing the shift in power, and Clara took a breath, firm and steady, like a gust of wind sweeping through the desert. "I deserve to be seen," she declared. The weight of her voice echoed hauntingly, trembling yet resolute, each word an affirmation of her truth. Charlie turned slightly to look at her, admiration blossoming in his chest as he witnessed her transformation. Here was the woman he had fought to protect, now standing tall. The leader, once so filled with bravado, faltered under the weight of her declaration. He glanced back at his gang, confusion flickering among them, and then turned on his heel, the bravado quickly dissolving into reticence. With a scowl, he retreated into the darkness from which he'd emerged, leaving behind echoes of uncertainty. Charlie felt Clara's hand squeeze tighter against his, a silent acknowledgement that they had not only confronted a threat, but had reshaped their destinies. As the night settled back into a hushed calm, the weight of shared pain began to lift, revealing a new resilience forged from their collective strength. Together, they had weathered the storm, and beneath the vast, star-studded sky, the dawn of dignity began to shimmer on the horizon, illuminating the path toward healing and hope. The cool night air settled over Elmsworth, wrapping the town in a blanket of tranquility that felt foreign after the storm of confrontation. The distant laughter from the saloon had faded into a mere echo, a reminder of the chaos that had unfolded mere moments ago. Charlie stood on the porch, the weight of both his past and the unspoken bond he'd forged with Clara hanging heavy between them. The air felt charged with new possibility, a flicker of hope igniting in the space where darkness had once reigned. Clara, standing beside him, drew in a deep breath, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for a glimpse of the dawn that was bound to follow. In that moment, Charlie turned to Clara, his heart swelling with an unexpected sense of pride. She had faced the challenge head-on, her voice rising above fear, and in doing so, she had reclaimed a part of herself that had long been lost. The bruises that once spoke of pain now seemed to shimmer faintly under the emerging moonlight, not as marks of suffering, but as badges of survival and resilience. He felt a rush of warmth toward her, a quiet admiration building in the depths of his chest and he took a step closer, allowing the heat of his presence to envelop her, offering solace against the remnants of their shared turmoil. As Clara's gaze drifted back down from the horizon, she met Charlie's eyes, and in that instant, an unspoken promise passed between them. They had weathered the storm together, not as victims, but as allies, and a newfound strength pulsed through the air, infusing the night with a sense of urgency to embrace the future. The town of Elmsworth, with its dust-choked streets and jagged edges, felt smaller, and for the first time, the oppressive weight of loneliness began to lift. Together, they had forged a connection that defied the isolation they had both carried for so long, a bond forged in the crucible of their pain, now tinged with the optimism of new beginnings. Their resolute stance against the darkness had awakened something within the town itself, a ripple of change that promised to unravel the silence that had long kept its residents captive. Charlie could feel it in the stillness surrounding them, the weight of unspoken truths ready to surge forth like a river breaking free from its dam. The air crackled with anticipation, and he could sense that the people of Elmsworth would no longer shy away from confronting their demons. This was not merely a shift for themselves, but an invitation for others to join in the reclamation of their narratives, a clarion call for those who had suffered in silence. With the moon rising high above, bathing the landscape in a silver glow, Clara took a small step forward, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a burgeoning sense of hope. Charlie watched as she stood a little taller, her shoulders squared, as if she were shedding the cloak of uncertainty that had clung to her for far too long. In that shared silence, she was no longer just Charlie's maid. She was a woman ready to embrace her own story, one that demanded to be lived, not just endured. He could see the flicker of determination in her eyes, and it set his own heart ablaze with newfound purpose. Together, he murmured, a quiet vow meant only for her, a pledge that they would navigate this rocky terrain hand in hand. Clara looked at him, her gaze unwavering, and a small, genuine smile broke through the remnants of her past. It was a smile that spoke of burgeoning freedom, a glimpse into the future they could craft together, one where their voices would resonate in the spaces that had once kept them quiet. And as they stood there, side by side under the expansive sky, the weight of the past began to loosen, giving way to the dawn of what could be, a bright horizon waiting to be explored. The stars twinkled above like shimmering promises, and Charlie felt a cautious optimism bloom within him. Elmsworth was still a town steeped in shadows, but now it pulsed with a dynamic energy that hinted at transformation. Hand in hand, he and Clara would challenge the silence that had long plagued their lives, stepping into a world that, while fraught with uncertainty, was filled with hope. The night whispered of new beginnings, and in that moment, amid the remnants of chaos, they both took a deep breath, ready to welcome the dawn together, a resolute step toward healing, toward a future where their voices would echo loud and clear against the backdrop of their shared lives.